Thank you, Ida, so much. And thank you everybody for coming. I really, really appreciate, and maybe one day we will actually meet in person. So hopefully, finger crossed. My name is Marina Fischer, and I'm curator of numismatics at University of Calgary. What it really means is that I work with money. Ancient coins, modern coins, paper money, everything. We have an incredible collection at the University of Calgary, about over 23,000 objects, and they're really, really incredible stuff, focusing primarily on ancient Greek and Roman coinage, but we have absolutely everything. It is really, really incredible. So if that's something that interests you, you're always welcome to email me. And currently we have an exhibition on display at the University Library in Nickel Galleries on the main floor, and it's called Money Zoo, Fantastic Beasts in the History of Money. So essentially it's exhibition that explores animals as money and animals on money, and in a really short way to describe it. So I also work with classics and religion department very closely. So this is why I am part of this series. And what I would like to do is combine the topics that do not generally come together. And this is truly a shame that we do not talk about this aspect of art more often, because it is not a very widely known fact that the bankers of Florence bankrolled the Italian Renaissance. This is really what we're going to look at, and it's absolutely fascinating. So money, banking, and the birth of modern art. And this is really my thesis. This is what I want to discuss. So let me just get okay, so how Florentine merchants and bankers, which is at that time pretty much the same thing, got around the Catholic Church's ban on money lending and bankrolled the Renaissance. So this is the thesis. This is what we're going to explore and see how it all happened. And the art that we are talking about, I just got a little collage here, but it's from the most of like the masterpieces of this period all the way to the modern art. So here we are on the timeline, because I really want to start from the beginning, and I always try to do that, because we need to look at the big picture. We are talking about a period of classical world, which is ancient Greek and Roman world. So we are talking about 700 BC, before Common Era, and then we're going all the way pretty much to 1600s, or basically into early 1500s, to be maybe more precise. So we are covering this whole period, which is over 1,000 years. Sorry, over 2,000 years. And it is really incredible. And what is really interesting is that a classical world, the ancient Greek and Roman world, is the foundation, and still really is the foundation for everything that is happening in our definitely artistic world. So it is either directly inspired by it, or it is a direct reaction to it, more in a negative way, or a rejection of it. So either way, we are interacting with the past all the time. So we're going to look at well, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time to kind of dig very deep into the topics. So I will try to do the best, but please feel free to ask questions. I'm really happy to clarify things. So what really happened is that we have this incredible period of the classical civilization, and then we have the fall of Rome, or end of the classical world at the end of the 5th century, Common Era. And then we have a period of darkness, as I like to call it. Not really, but it's the medieval period, which basically just means in between. So, or Middle Ages. So in the middle of classical world and the revival of that same classical world, which is essentially the Renaissance. And many scholars look at the modern world and modern art from 1500s onwards. So that's what we are going to look at. This is the outline. So just that you right away know how I've structured the talk and what we will be covering. So first we will be talking about the history of banking, so Christian attitude towards money, then about usury and way out of hell, Medici and the first European banks, the Renaissance or the rebirth of classicism, and then closing with the Medici and the birth of modern art. So let's start with the history of banking. When we look at money, and especially religion, we are starting in the medieval period really right now. So we have to look at the Christian attitude towards money because it is going to affect everything. There is a lot of art, uh, mostly really fantastic paintings that capture that Christian attitude towards money. Here we have a really well-known painting by Masaccio. It's called A Tribute Money, in which we see the disciples right here in the middle with Christ, and they are confronted by the tax collector. And there is a big argument amongst the disciples. Do they have to pay the Jewish tax or not? Should they not? And then Jesus finally says to Peter, just go to the lake, take the fish out. Inside the fish's mouth, you will find a coin, and then pay that money to the tax collector for you and I. And actually right here is the actual coin that was used for the Jewish temple tax payment. And it's actually right on display at this time, so you can check it out. But even if we look at the painting right here, so here's disciples and Jesus talking to the tax collector. Here's Peter at a lake getting the fish, and here is Peter giving the coin to the tax collector. So even if we look at the color or of the skin of the tax collector comparing to the rest of the figures in the painting, we can see that he's here, especially in the shadow. There's this darkness about him. So in a way, already indicating that there is something wrong here. There is something not as it should be. A more famous example is the payment of 30 pieces of silver to Judas by the Jewish priests. And we have, again, lots of representation of that moment when Judas receives the bag of money or the coins themselves. This is just one of the examples because I just wanted to get you really to understand and to get the feel of the art that was produced with those subject matters. And here as well, we have Judas receiving the 30 pieces of silver from the Jewish priests. The third example that is really well known when it comes to Christian attitude towards money is the incident in the temple in Jerusalem when Jesus arrives to the temple for the Passover and enters the courtyard and unleashes his anger at the money changers. You might have come across this passage. You may be familiar with it. I certainly was for a really long time, but I never actually really understood what happened. Why did Jesus get angry at these money changers? And what does money changer actually mean? This is the incident chronologically that we see that is the earliest in this Christian story, because we have the direct reference to the money changers or money lenders or different terms that are used for the same activity right here in the first century Jerusalem. The same activity is what we will be talking about in later period in Italy. But what these money changers were doing is exactly that. They were changing money because everybody from all areas in the Holy Land and Syria, Egypt, Arabia, coming up from different regions would bring their own coins to buy the votive offerings, the sacrifices at the temple, and also to pay the tax to the temple. The only coins that a temple was accepting were those big silver Tyrian shekels that I've just shown you earlier in the slide. So in order to get those coins, people would enter the temple courtyard and they would approach a money changer at his table, and they would hand him the foreign currency. They would receive the Tyrian shekels, and on top of that, the money changer would take an interest. We know the interest was quite high. Some references tell us about 26 to 36%, which is quite a lot. Another really fascinating thing that I like to think about is how good these people were at math, because they had to do it so fast and only using the scales, which is quite incredible. That is the reason why Jesus got really angry at the money changers, because they were charging an interest, which is essentially exactly the term that we will be looking at more closely, usury. So let's talk about usury and what it actually means. At that time that we are looking at, so pretty much during the medieval period, so pretty much let's look at the end of the fall of the Roman Empire, so from 5th century onwards, there are only very few ways that you can borrow money. One is from a loan shark, which is really bad, really high interest and dangerous loans if you cannot repay it. The second one is from the Jewish money changers, because the Jewish people were allowed to charge interest for foreigners, not for their fellow Israelites, but they were allowed to charge interest to the foreigners or anybody who is not Jew. And the third one were merchants. This was more that wasn't really something certain. It really depended on the merchant, where the merchant was located, what kind of trade the merchant was involved with, and very often there would be very little fee that was taken for that. So in order to actually borrow money, you need to have an incentive, or people need to have an incentive to loan money. And the only way you can do that is really if you earn on that activity, on you loaning money. And that is what we call the interest. Loaning money is really important. I mean, look at our society here in North America, everywhere, Europe, and many, many countries in the world. We live and it exists the way we do because of the loans and the mortgages and the car loans and all of the things that we have, our credit cards. That is really the driving force of the capitalist and modern economy. If we do not have that, and we know this from other countries in the world and maybe do not operate on the same system, is that the economy is more stagnate, is not moving as fast, is not as, the country is not as prosperous as the countries that actually loan money. But what is really happening here with Christianity, with Christian faith during this medieval period? We know that money was feared in the Christian faith. So Christianity espoused poverty, mostly because it allowed for social mobility and therefore undermined the set medieval hierarchies. There is always a reason for everything. And this is what I particularly like looking at. What is behind the certain rules and motivations that we have? So we know that money was feared by the church, or at least that was the message. Christianity was propagating poverty. Again, for those reasons, they did not want the social mobility and did not want to upset the medieval hierarchy that existed already at that time. It thought that extracting interest on loan was evil. This is really the word. It was absolutely evil. One of the worst things that someone could do is charging interest. And because of that, church banned usury or charging interest, because they saw it as offending against the goodness of God. One of the very first actions against usury legally and officially was by the Emperor Charlemagne when he prohibited usury, and he actually wrote it into the law in the year 800. The basis for this really hostile attitude towards usury, loaning money and interest, is all based on biblical passages. We have the Old Testament passages and the New Testament passages. And I've just taken a couple examples right here. So all of these passages essentially communicate the message that it is a sin to take advantage of the misfortune of a fellow Christian. So man must live by the sweat of his brow, do not charge a fellow Israelite interest. So this is the one that I referred to when it came to Jewish moneylenders. And in the New Testament, again, there are lots of references to this, but this is one that was evoked quite often. But love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. Medieval theologians such as Thomas Aquinas considered usury to be contrary to nature. And here's the quote: "It is in accordance with nature that money should increase from natural goods and not from money itself." And what is really interesting is that this idea was based on earlier Greek writers by philosopher Aristotle. So here, to basically conclude and to demonstrate how serious usury was, is that eternal and earthly fate of the user was decided by the condemnation of general council. So there were various councils, you can see here examples, that continued in greater to create greater consequences for anybody who was involved in usury. And then finally culminates with equation with heresy and essentially death. A really interesting literary source for usury is Dante's Divine Comedy. In Dante's Divine Comedy, he creates this schema or this formula of hell, and known as 9 circles of hell, and the usurers were placed in the 7th circle of hell. This is Sandro Botticelli's later interpretation of Dante's circles of hell. So this is his map of hell. And again, just to show you one little detail where you can see how these things were illustrated, is quite serious and quite frightening for the people who were involved in money lending and money changing and usury to be looking at this imagery. And here's another one of my favorite as well. We have this is the entrance to the cathedral. We have Christ right here in the middle, and then heaven, hell, and then right here at the bottom we have a lineup of people who are waiting to be judged. And right here below hell, we have these horrifying hands coming out of nowhere and grabbing this poor soul. But if we pay attention to the figure on the left, we can see that this is a money lender or a money changer, because this person is holding a bag of coins. And you can see this image is quite terrifying, and especially because it would have been seen from the bottom, from the ground. That wide open mouth, this gaping mouth, is exactly what would have been seen by the viewer below, and it does look really horrifying. When it comes to paintings, we have this one at Cappella Strozzi in Florence, and it is the first reproduction of Dante's Inferno in this monumental painting. And we know that this chapel was visited by all the important and powerful families in Florence, meaning the banking families, the people who were involved in these activities. So they would they would enter this chapel, they would know that it was there, and they would essentially see themselves in the seventh circle of hell together with the blasphemous sodomites, and they would be there as moneylenders. So the bankers were accused of splintering society, creating debt, greed, division. And essentially, there were many, many reasons that these moneylenders or bankers, interchangeable terms, should do something to compensate for their sins. And we'll talk more about that in this section, which I named Way Out of Hell. Because there was way out of hell. And during the 13th century, we start to see this long existing concept of purgatory, which is essentially a space in between. It's in between hell and heaven. So you're not in hell, you're not in heaven, but if you spend certain time in purgatory, you can maybe get lucky and end up in heaven, but you kind of need to earn it. So this concept of purgatory was starting to become emphasized more and more as really the way out of hell for these money changers and the bankers. And according to that church doctrine, they could buy their way out of hell by purchasing salvation and sponsoring large and expensive art and architecture. So you can see where I'm going with this already. So in order to earn their salvation and purify their sins, and at the end up in heaven, they had to donate or sponsor large amounts of money and be patrons to really expensive art and architecture. So that philanthropy and patronage of Italian families, especially banking families, inspired by guilt for exactly that usury or for the interest charging. So here is really the core what we are talking about. This is really the focus of this thesis, is that Florence, because it was the center of banking activity in Italy, became the foundry of great artwork and set the stage for the Renaissance. And the center of the Renaissance is obviously Florence. And the bankers of Florence funded or bankrolled the Renaissance. If it weren't for this guilt, for those sins by the bankers and money changers, we wouldn't have the Renaissance and we wouldn't have the modern art. I don't know how this time would look like. I don't know what would be the outcome, the alternate outcome, but we do know this for certain. If it weren't for the sins and the guilt and the shame of the Florentine bankers and money changers, we would not have all of these amazing architecture and masterpieces. So this image of hell that I've just shown you in the Strozzi Chapel was ironically or expectedly paid for by a banker from the powerful Strozzi family. And he is here depicted on the opposite wall. And I just have the detail here where we see an angel leading him and his wife towards the congregation and towards heaven. So they earned their salvation and they're being accepted into the good society and into heaven. One of the most famous works, especially early works, is this one by a famed artist, Giotto, because he painted and possibly also designed the chapel. It is a private chapel that was designed for the Scriveni family, who were also bankers. So this chapel, this beautiful work of art that is always studied in art history when we talk about the early days of the Renaissance, the early stages of the Renaissance and how it continues to develop. So this is really the foundation of the art that is to come is paid for and commissioned by the banking family for their sins. We have a lot that we can talk about this chapel. There's some incredible art in here, especially when we look at it chronologically and historically, and the impact on different styles, and how we are slowly separating from the medieval, very rigid, two-dimensional imagery into more three-dimensional, realistic imagery of the Renaissance. And one of the things, maybe just a point here, because it is so prominent, is the blue ceiling that symbolizes the sky. Up to this point, the ceilings in these religious buildings would have been gold to symbolize the heaven of God. So now we are starting to see the blue color that is realistic, and it represents the color of the sky. And on this west wall, we have the scene of the Last Judgment. They were very common in chapels and churches. And it is essentially exactly what I've just shown you in sculpture on the cathedral door. We have Christ in the middle, we have the heaven on his right, and we have the hell on his left. And since we do know why this chapel was commissioned, and it is essentially, sorry, my text is covered by the Zoom thing, because a person that was mentioned by Dante, his son, a relative, I apologize, I can't see my text, ended up commissioning this chapel painted by this celebrated artist Giotto to essentially pay or expiate the family's sins. And here he is, right here, Enrico Scrovegni, kneeling in front of his patron saints with his private priest, donating or essentially offering the chapel. This is the building, how it looks from outside, for his sins, and hoping to buy his salvation, because look, he's representing himself on the right side, on the side of heaven, even though he knows, and everybody knows in his family, that they actually really belong in hell. And hell is not pretty. It is quite terrifying. And the medieval period and those early days of the Renaissance are really well known for this horrific images of hell. And this is exactly where Enrico and his family belong. This is a really interesting book. If you're interested, I like to give some suggestions if you're interested to read more about it. But to summarize, essentially, is that we know that the bankers were never quite sure, because the doctrine was a bit fluid. It was a bit flexible. Some believed that the usury was, the letter of exchange, that is essentially the act of usury, and we will talk about in more detail, was wrong. And others believed that maybe it wasn't as bad as it was initially thought. So some of their sponsorship was penitential, but then the bankers began to realize that in giving money, they can also define the image that is produced by their money. And this is really, really interesting. This is where we see the shift happening. At the beginning, and again, it's a driving force for sure. We have that fear and shame and guilt, but then consciously or unconsciously, we start to see that shift where they start to use images to change the attitude towards money. Like, for example, begin to use the images to undermine the resistance to money. Here is one such examples. This is by the Strozzi family, since we are talking about them here. where we see um, baby Jesus lying in front of Mary, who is worshiping him. Here's Joseph, and here is Filippo Strozzi kneeling and bowing and praying to Christ, who is actually forced to get up a little bit because he couldn't see. So it is actually, and that's what I'm talking about. So it's this unconscious or subconscious way of depicting things, and art has this incredible ability to capture the feel of the time, the atmosphere of the time, and mostly unknowingly. And that is really where the wealth of our information comes from, because it's the truth, because art never lies. So we have this capsulation of time, which the Germans call Zeitgeist. So it's this time capsule that is captured in these works of art, from which we can learn the ideology and the attitudes of the people at the time who were depicted in these paintings, or who commissioned that art. So we can see here the banker, extremely powerful figure in the city of Florence, leaning and kneeling kind of with one knee towards Christ, and baby Jesus needs to make an effort to towards Philip Strozzi so that he could see him and then eventually bless him. So bankers wanted works of art to highlight their wealth and power, but a beauty aspect allowed them to purify their money. And we will see a lot of beauty, which is one of the really important elements of the Renaissance art, especially when we are talking about Italy. So the beauty purifies their dirty money to shake off the vulgarity and the sense of sin that has always been associated with them and with the money. So how does that continue to develop? And the Medici family is the best example to explore these ideas and to see how the banking evolved, how the practices of money changing and money lending evolve into quite complicated and complex institutions. The Medici family is the family that founded the first banks in Italy. And very quickly, the banks spread across Europe. The reason for that is there were a lot of people who lived in Florence, and a lot of people also left the city of Florence, but they were still highly connected, very closely connected with their families in Florence. And they had that community as well of the people coming from the same city all over Europe. And these expats essentially create connections and open the bank branches for the Medici family or other Italian banking families. And this is really the key for the success of the Medici family. The founding member of the family, Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, and we'll talk a little bit about him, then Cosimo de' Medici, who is really the one that built up the banking system and built up and accumulated the wealth and power of the Medici family. They will persist through generations. And then we sort of have a little bit of skipping of the gifted members of the family, and then we move on to Lorenzo the Magnificent. Lorenzo the Magnificent is really the key figure for us when we are talking about bankrolling the Renaissance. So starting with Giovanni, I already mentioned he was the founder of the Medici dynasty and also the founder of the first Medici bank in 1397. Soon after that, Cosimo, his son, inherits the business, and he is that mastermind of the banking system and the politics in general. He was proclaimed as a genius, and it is said that one of his best qualities was ability to judge person's character. And we see as soon as Cosimo dies, that ability is gone and the business starts to suffer. But here Cosimo built the banking system, the Medici banking system across Europe. And he was absolutely determined, because of the wealth and power that he accumulated, to wipe the stain of usury from his family's reputation. And we do know that in 1430s, Pope promised Cosimo redemption if he paid for the construction of the monastery of Saint Marco. So Cosimo jumped at this opportunity because it was a really unique opportunity. And it was the first example where one family paid for the whole building, for the whole monastery. Usually they would contribute pieces here and there, and then together they would be able to create something wonderful. But in this case, we start to see Cosimo giving a lot of money to the Catholic Church to wash his sins, but also it's an incredible opportunity to launder his piles of dirty money and also buy his ticket to heaven. We also know that when the monastery was built, it's still standing, the Pope gave Cosimo in writing, so there is the inscription that says that Cosimo and his family have earned their redemption and their place in heaven. Another really interesting thing is that Cosimo sponsored the founding of the Neoplatonic Academy in Florence. And right away, we start to see interests in classicism and revival of those classical values and art from the very beginning, because obviously it's something that interests them due to that difficulty of dealing with the church and Christianity's attitude towards money. The change of the regime, the change of the system would certainly be welcomed by the bankers. I've already mentioned these letters of exchange, and this is the key, this is the genius of the Medici family. They invented, or at least this is what it says, what is said. Some people don't really think that this is truly the contribution of the Medici family, possibly, or already existing, and they adopted it. Nonetheless, here I will say that they invented the letter of exchange, which is essentially like modern check. So, for example, a banker would give a client 1,000 florins, the gold coins of Florence, in one city with a pledge that the loan would then be paid back in another city within 3 months in that local currency. So essentially what was happening is that by changing the currency, so for example, they would give 1,000 florins, and then the person, so they would get this letter of exchange or the cash, and then they would receive the amount, let's say, of 1,200 florins, but maybe let's say in French coins. So they were able to calculate in that interest without being very obvious. And because church was also a really big, took many loans from the bankers, it was willing to turn the blind eye. So this is that profit was made on the exchange rate, and everybody welcomed it because it was really dangerous to travel in general, but it was also really dangerous to travel with money. So the traders, the merchants, they always definitely preferred to have this letter of exchange and then go to the Medici bank in another city in Europe than to actually carry this money with them and then possibly being robbed and killed as well. So we see that through this system, the Medici banks became the largest, the most powerful, and the most respected banks in Europe. That coin that I mentioned is the florins. So it's a Florentine gold coin that was introduced in 1252, and it was the dominant currency in Europe until 1533. So the strongest currency for 300 years and it created international trade. So that's what I was talking about. We had a really live trade based on loaning and interest and so on during the Roman world. And when that collapsed, everything stopped. There was no trade. There was nothing. It was just barter, mostly trading with products in local, and it was very local economy. So now with the creation of the proper currency, ability to do large amounts of transactions creates this international trade. The coin is really interesting and very appropriate because we see the Lily of Florence on the main side on the obverse, and we have St. John the Baptist on the reverse or the back of the coin. So symbolically, we see this civic identity and religious beliefs fused in their money. And this is a really nice quote that I want to share with you. So with the creation of their gold florin, the Florentines provided a safe currency. So currency that was well respected, it was trusted, it was high quality gold. And that's what it means. It was safe currency in international trade. And they did so at a strategic moment of overall development. So all of these things that we were just talking about. This development was notably symbolized by a rising bourgeoisie, the merchant class, the expansion of the industry and trade, and flourishing activity of banking and finance. So all of this in large part because of the powerful Medici family. And we do have some really wonderful illustrations of banking practices. This is a painting from the 1400s. So this is a typical scene in the banking house. So we have this big table, and it's always quite busy. There are a lot of customers, but I wanted to show you this one because this is the typical banker's table, which is called banco or banca. And if the banker lost his business, the loans were not returned, he would have to break the table ceremoniously and publicly. So this is where the word bankruptcy comes from. So this is that banco or banca, the big table where the coins were kept, the scales, the weights, the abacus, and all of the other calculating instruments, and the books. Importantly, the books were there as well. Here, another wonderful depiction of banking activities is really, really busy. And here, especially, you can see the lineup of people going to the bank. If you are interested in the topic, these are two wonderful books that you can check out as well. So let's move on to the Renaissance or the rebirth of classicism. And I want to talk a little bit about what does it actually mean, because it is quite important. What is the birth of classicism? So I mentioned at the very beginning, it's the revival of the values and ideas and art and architecture of ancient Greek and Roman world. That collapsed during the medieval period. So we have about 1,000 years, almost 1,000 years of that middle age, of that time in between. And the image on the left is what I chose to show you, a typical medieval art. It's called the icon with sacred figures. So we have Virgin Mary with Christ, very two-dimensional. And here on the right, we have Raphael's Sistine Madonna. And if you just compare these two imagery, so they're both Madonnas and they're both holding Christ or associated with the baby Christ, baby Jesus, you can see the incredible difference. And I find the comparison imagery very powerful because sometimes we forget what we are actually talking about and the progression and the differences in the chronology and the different styles. So the birthplace of the Renaissance was Florence because it was the thriving commercial center, because of the Florentine bankers. So this is the symbol of Florence still today, the cathedral. Just to, again, summarize really quickly. So French word Renaissance refers to the act of Rebirth. So during the Renaissance, many European scholars and artists, especially in Italy, studied the learning and art of ancient Greece and Rome. They wanted to recapture the spirit of the Greek and Roman cultures in their own artistic, literary, and philosophical works. So here as well, I have very similarly showing you in this diagram what the Renaissance really is, when it happened, and different things. So you can check that out as well. And again, the best way that I wanted to summarize this for you to truly understand in the matter of seconds what I'm trying to share with you. So in Italy especially, the Renaissance was spurred by revival of Greek and Roman learning. Works by classical authors lost to the West for centuries were rediscovered, and with them a new humanistic outlook that placed man and human achievements at the center of all things. What it essentially means is that during the medieval period, the age of faith, the center was on God. Everything was about God. God was the measure of all things. And now, with this switch in thinking, with the switch in ideology, with these humanist values, we see humanity or people as the center of all things, as as a measure as well of all things. So humanist values shaped many things, obviously, during Renaissance, but for our purposes, definitely art. So we see individualism, classical learning, secularism, the inherent dignity and beauty of human being is being celebrated, the civic virtue and patriotism, just to name some of the main ones. The Renaissance officially, the way we see it, starts with this event of the commission of the baptistry doors in Florence. And these doors, which were extremely expensive, were sponsored by Giovanni di Bicci. So the founder of the Medici family. So the doors project alerted Giovanni and the rest of the Medici family to this potential of art and what art can do for them. So that's really the beginning. So we're looking at 1401 approximately. So here is the Florentine Cathedral, and right in front of it is the baptistry, and it has 3 doors that were built. And this was the really important moment in artistic history or history of art when we have this competition for the Florentine baptistry doors. We have the panels, the 2 surviving panels of the 2 finalists. On the left, we have Filippo Brunelleschi. On the right, we have the winner, Lorenzo Ghiberti. And Ghiberti ended up working for like 20, 30 years on these doors. That was essentially the rest of his life. But I usually like to really kind of dig into this comparison and look at very closely in great detail what is really happening here. But in this case, I'm going to jump and tell you what is really happening, because it is absolutely marvelous. It is the best example in my mind that illustrates very quickly and perfectly what the Renaissance was about, and that departure from the medieval style and period. So we have the scene of sacrifice of Isaac by his father Abraham from the biblical story. But you don't have to know the story or anything here. But what is really important, and the key figure here, is Isaac, the figure of Isaac, the youth that was about to be killed by his father. He wasn't, he was saved by God. But if we look at the body, and if we're talking about the Renaissance and these values, humanist values, so humanity or the people being the measure of all things, the body, the human body, the physical existence being the measure of all things and being celebrated. So it is the body that we need to focus on, that we need to look at. So here we have the emancipated Isaac, which is exactly in the tradition of the medieval style, which saw the body as evil. The physical, this is the origin of the sin. The material, this is the origin of the sin. While in comparison, in this new vision that Ghiberti had, the new style that he introduced by studying and looking at rediscovered classical art, he depicts something completely different. So here we have a celebration of human body. And this is really what Renaissance is all about, the celebration of humanity. So here you can see it a little bit more closely. And here as well, we see Abraham wearing a toga, so Roman clothing. So absolutely inspired by the actual examples that he studied. And you can see the example from the bronze statue from ancient Greece, 5th century ancient BCA ancient Greece. And we can see that famous stance called contrapposto, where the figure is standing only on one leg, and there is a twist in the body. A little bit hard to see here, but it's this S, and you can see it here as well. He's leaning on, he's kneeling on his knees, but you can clearly see that contrapposto. You can imagine that leg bent and this leg holding the body. So that's in a nutshell what Renaissance was really about. It was the revival of classical art and classical values. So how does that fit with the Medici and our story of the birth of modern art? So now we get to Lorenzo the Magnificent, Lorenzo de' Medici, who was Cosimo's grandson. And he is really the person in the Medici family, in that dynasty, that is most responsible for founding or introducing or bankrolling essentially the new art and the new style and the new ideas, because he was greatly interested in art. This was something that mattered to him greatly, and he was really obsessed about classical art and classical ideas. He also founded an art academy in his garden and then in his palaces, and they were the first art schools. He was only interested in classical art, so we have a lot of nudity, nude figures, again, celebration of human body, the physical world, and the school represents the birth of European secular art. So we have this break from religious art, and now we are looking at non-religious subject matter. So towards the end of the 15th century, the artist workshops, where the apprentices trained, where the work was created, where the experiments were made, had become a small center of scientific study in an attempt to raise the status of their profession. And here on the right, I list all of the activities that were being done in a workshop. And again, this was all paid for by Lorenzo. And essentially, Lorenzo's art states we don't need God anymore. We have gods of art. So in a kind of poetic way to share with you what really was happening at that time, and how we having this great switch. So Lorenzo also financed the translations of many of classical texts into Latin and into vernacular Italian, which was really important for the further study. Sandro Botticelli, who was very close with the Medici family, depicted the Medici family here in a religious scene. Here is Cosimo, who is dead already, but he is one of the Magi about to touch Jesus's feet. Baby Jesus is held by Mary. And then we have the rest of I think this is Lorenzo. We have the rest of the Medici family and their scholars and their associates and everybody, their supporters are in this painting. But this is truly an incredible display of power and wealth. We can see the incredible clothing, all the gold and silks and wonderful cloths and fabric that are used in this painting. And Botticelli as well paints himself here too. So we start to see the rise of status of artists. And that's something that happens during the Renaissance, something that lasts to the modern day. Another really amazing painting. I'm not going to go into details, obviously, of these paintings, unfortunately, but maybe we'll meet again. Here, this is Botticelli's Birth of Venus that he painted for Lorenzo's cousin for his wedding, based on classical mythology and inspired by classical sculpture and art. And to the modern day, this face is very recognizable and placed on many, many products. The second one that he painted for Lorenzo is the Allegory of Spring. Again, a painting that is really important for our study and understanding of modern art. Obviously, Leonardo da Vinci, and the most important and best known painting in the world, seconded by his Last Supper in Milan. And then Michelangelo's David, and Michelangelo was Lorenzo de' Medici was his patron, and he took him under his wing when he was very, very young, and educated him and provided everything that Michelangelo needed to create, to be this genius and to create those masterpieces. And here is an excellent example of those classical values, and the classical sculpture incorporated and mimicked in a way with a twist in this David, in his David. The Sistine Chapel ceiling, the most important panel, or best known, I should say, panel, where we have Adam being created by God. And that figure of Adam right here, very muscular, beautiful proportions. And here we can see, we know that Michelangelo's inspiration for that was this Belvedere torso, the classical torso, and this is Michelangelo's drawing and study of the torso. Another one in the Sistine Chapel is this Last Judgment that we see on the wall here, commissioned by Pope Julius II. And here is the close-up of it. It wasn't really well received when the clergy came to see the final product, and it was described along this like something like the orgy of naked bodies, and they were really unhappy with this, and they made Michelangelo cover the genitals as much as possible, which we can see here. But what I want to point out here is, so it's exactly the same thing. We have heaven on this side and hell on this side and Christ in the middle, just like the one that we saw in Scribania Chapel. And here, look at the culmination of what we've been talking about. So completely moving away from that religious figure, religious style to the Renaissance, and essentially leading into Baroque. And here I've already shown you this one, Raphael's, who was also artist under the wing of the Medici's, Sistine Madonna, this beautiful face. And I really like this quote, you can come back to it. And this imagery is, again, really, really well known and appears on many products. I have just a few slides to show you. The Renaissance moves up north. There are a lot of Italian banking families in the north as well. The influence spreads. Here, this is Albert Dürer, the most influential artist in Northern Europe, who traveled a lot to Italy and brought those ideas and values back north. And we see here a self-portrait. So the importance of self-portraits, I mean, look how far we got with the selfies. It really starts right here. Portraits, self-portraits, images of nature for nature's sake, completely lack of any religious imagery, including grass and studying our world around us and valuing it. Genre scenes of just people doing daily things. And then we're moving on to further studies of human character. This is Rembrandt. I should have said that. And here, Jan Vermeer with his Girl with a Pearl Earring, which is already moving into the 17th century. And here, I want to end where we began, so we can see how that full circle came from the classical art to the medieval art, and then the Renaissance, where we see that birth of great change that continues to persist through all of these different styles, going all the way to the contemporary art. And I'm going to end here. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing this. And I really hope this made sense.